I'm going to start with some slides in a minute, and I'm not sure if I need this, but I'll use it anyway for the moment. When the inquest finished on the 26th of April this year, more than 2 years had passed since we first met the jury on the 31st of March 2014. In addition to that 2-year period, I had spent the previous 9 months working on almost nothing else but the forthcoming inquests, and I imagine it was pretty much the same for Brenda. So by the time this case concluded, I had worked almost exclusively on nothing but the Hillsborough Inquests, and so I'm sure that if we were required to do so, Brenda and I, and indeed Anna, who is also with us, who was one of the other barristers in the family teams, we could talk about Hillsborough for the next week and we wouldn't repeat ourselves. But we don't have a week. We want to give you an opportunity to ask questions and for other contributions, and so I am going to try and limit myself to around about 40 minutes or thereabouts. But I want to start by trying to set the scene for you as to how the disaster actually happened. Now, this is a plan of at least part of the ground, the bit that matters, and the bit that we're talking about in particular, I've got a ruler for this bit, is the Liverpool end. This, for those of you who don't know the layout of the Hillsborough ground, this is the Leppings Lane end, and Leppings Lane you can just see on the far left of the screen. And for this match, the Liverpool fans had the West Stand, which is a seated area, the Leppings Lane Terrace, which is where the disaster happened, and the North Stand. And Nottingham Forest, who were the opposition, had the South Stand here and the Cop end on this side, which for our purposes we don't need to include. And so this Leppings Lane end was divided, as you can just about see. I'm afraid ignore all the numbers, they were for different purposes. But there were pens. There was a perimeter fence which prevented incursions onto the pitch. But over the years, the terrace here had been divided up. So you had what was actually all one pen here, pen 1 and 2, with a fence here, which was about 5 foot high. These are the two central pens, pen 3 and pen 4, and it's in those pens that all of those who died did die. There was a small area here which was actually called pen 5, but was in fact meant to be kept clear of all spectators. And then beyond that you had what was called pen 6, and I suppose also pen 7, although it didn't really come into play greatly. And because of segregation, because the plan was that as far as possible Liverpool fans and Nottingham Forest fans did not meet, at least in the vicinity of the ground, the 24,000 Liverpool fans who were attending that day all had to enter through the turnstiles at the Leppings Lane end. And I've just, in the next slide, blown this up slightly so it's a little easier to see. You see where the figure 1 is in blue? Well, that is an entranceway between number 115, which was actually a small shop. This is the River Don, which flows around the back of the South Stand. And where the 60 is the abutment of a bridge across the river. So there was quite a narrow entranceway there, which then, as you can see, fed into where the turnstiles were. Now, first of all, you can see marked the perimeter gates on the outside, and then 2 banks of turnstiles. These turnstiles here, of which there were 16, gave access to all the fans who were either going into the North Stand or into the West Stand. And that left 7 turnstiles here, numbers A to G, or letters A to G, through which all 10,100 people who had tickets for the Leppings Lane terraces were expected to enter. This area here, where the 26 is a service road that also runs down behind the stand. It doesn't give access to the ground at this end. Here is a photograph, and you can see now these perimeter gates. one of the interesting things, the differences between the previous year when exactly the same match was played between the same two clubs, was that these gates here, which actually feed into this service road, which you can see where the van is, were kept closed all afternoon. Indeed, so were these. And so fans who wanted to go into the 7 turnstiles into the Leppings Lane end had to file through these too, which had the effect of keeping the bulk of the fans waiting to get in outside these gates. And one of the key differences that undoubtedly was relevant on the day was that because all of these gates were open, people congregated not just directly in front of the turnstiles, the other side of that blue barrier, but in large numbers in this area inside these gates as far as the turnstiles, with no realistic hope of getting in because people were crammed into this area directly in front of the turnstiles themselves, as you can see in the next slide. Those are the 7 turnstiles that the fans had to enter. This is obviously taken, I guess, on the day after the disaster. And so you can see there are 3 double doors and then there's one on its own down there. This gate on this side here, a concertina, as you can just see, it's a similar construction to the one you can see on the far left. This is gate C, and this is an exit gate. Obviously, at the end of a game, you want to let spectators out of the ground far, far quicker than they come in, and there's no difficulty from a safety point of view with that. But it would have to be extremely rare for that ever to be used as an entrance. But it was used on the day of the disaster when the crowd out here became so enormous that the police realised that the only chance of avoiding crushing and deaths outside the ground was to open that gate. And that gate was opened at 8 minutes to 3 that afternoon. So this is the area that these 10,100 people had to congregate in front of in order to get through the turnstiles. This was the tunnel that gave access to the central pens 3 and 4. And if, bearing in mind this was a neutral ground, this is Sheffield Wednesday's ground, and in those days semi-finals of the FA Cup were played on a neutral ground. And although fans from Liverpool, some of them will have been at the match the previous year, Sheffield Wednesday weren't in what was then the First Division at the time. So that would have been the last time any of the Liverpool fans would have had to familiarise themselves with the layout of this ground. It wasn't a ground that they went to every 2 weeks or so. And it's got a big sign above it, as you can see, says standing. So if you go in through the turnstiles, or when it was open, gate C, and you're looking as to where to go, that's quite a big clue, isn't it, as to where to go. Now, in actual fact, you could gain entrance onto the terrace on either of the wings. But you wouldn't know that from this. This wall here, and you see the gateway through it, if you went through there, you could work your way round to the far side on one of the wing terraces, 6 and 7. But as you can see, not so much as a sign of any sort on that wall, much less one saying access to Leppings Lane Terrace this way. There was also a possibility of getting onto the terrace from this side, pens 1 and 2. And further down here, I haven't bothered with a slide of it, there was a tiny sign saying standing, but you had to be standing underneath the sign in order to see it. It was so small. So this is the view immediately as you go through the turnstiles. And as you saw from one of the earlier slides, gate C just off to the right. So anyone coming into this area would naturally assume that this was the way to go if you were standing. Now, in the days before pens were put in, you could go down that tunnel and fan out all across the terrace. So if you found it was busy behind the goal, and traditionally in the days of standing on terraces, people always liked to congregate behind the goal, you could fan out. You could say, well, it's a bit too crowded here, I'll move down. But once you put the pens in, it was, to all intent and purpose, impossible to move. You simply had nowhere to go. And so that's the problem that you had there. And to give you an idea about the difficulty, there was no overcrowding at the Leppings Lane end. Expert evidence was given during the course of the recent inquests to show that the number of people inside the ground at 3 o'clock did not exceed the number of tickets that had been issued for the day. So the problem at the Leppings Lane end wasn't too many people on the terrace, it was too many people in the wrong places. With an all-ticket match like this, the club have worked on the basis that they have a capacity at that end of 10,100 and they sell 10,100 tickets. And that would be on the basis that when everybody is in, they're all packed in reasonably tightly. You certainly should not be able to see, as you clearly can here, particularly down towards the front, the actual concrete of the terracing. That's an obvious sign that there are too few people in there for the numbers that are permitted. And you can see large numbers of people. This man here, for example, you can see all of him. And people down here, but also further back, you can see that this is seriously underpopulated. Now, this photograph was taken, we know, at just about 3 o'clock that afternoon. And by this stage, people were already being crushed to death in the central pens. And the final slide I'm going to show you is at the far other end. This is the way that you could have got on, where you could have got to if you'd gone through, if you knew to go through that gateway in the wall that I showed you just now. And again, you can see, look here, you can see the steps of the terracing. And you can see, if you look about halfway up above the fence, you can see people with their hands in their pockets. You can see their trousers and so on. So again, massively underpopulated here. And yet in the central pens, massively overcrowded. And that's really where the actual problem arose on this day. Now, what happened in terms of the crushing was that when Gate C was opened, ordered to be opened by the senior officer on the ground, a man by the name of David Duckenfield, about 2,000, slightly over 2,000 people entered in a period of about 5 minutes after 14:52 that afternoon. By that stage, the central pens 3 and 4 were already over capacity. There was no extra room, but 2,000 odd people were being ferried through that gate. There was very strong evidence at the recently concluded inquest that in the previous year, the stage had come when the police had realised that the central pens were full and they closed the gates. Or if they didn't physically close the gates, they did all that was actually necessary, which was to put a few bobbies across the mouth of the gate and say, it's too full in here, you need to go that way or that way, but you can't come in here. That didn't happen in 1989. So the bulk of those 2,000 extra people went straight down the tunnel thinking that was the way in, and of course caused, that led to the crush inside those pens. Now, I just want to deal at this stage with a myth that grew up around this and which, surprise, surprise, 26 years later was still being peddled by some of the South Yorkshire police officers who gave evidence at the new inquests. And their version of how this all happened was this. By around about 1:30 that afternoon, people were already starting to come in to the ground. And some of their witness statements referred to family groups with children and older people coming in, as if they were going to a picnic. You ought to bear in mind that football grounds in the 1980s were pretty rough places. But the account that the police gave was that the early arrivals were these nice family groups, very pleasant people and all the rest of it. And they came in and naturally went down to the front to get a good view of the game. And that the disaster was caused when later on, getting up towards 3 o'clock, a lot of particularly young, drunken fans, many of them without tickets, of course taking advantage of the opening of the gate, poured into the ground, rushed down the tunnel and crushed their friends and colleagues who'd been in there for an hour and a half. Completely and utterly wrong. somewhere between a quarter and a third, so possibly as many as about 30 of those who died in the crush, only got into the ground after Gate C was opened at 8 minutes to 2. So they hadn't been in there for an hour and 20 minutes. Many of them only got into the ground when that gate was opened to allow that large number of people in. And they were in the group of people who came in and went down the tunnel. And such were the dynamics of the crowd in there that many of them got somehow or other pushed all the way down to the front. But the curious thing about the pattern of deaths is it wasn't a question of everybody who died was crushed up against the perimeter fence at the front, as you might imagine. In actual fact, very few of the people crushed up against the fence died. Some of the worst photographs that were shown in newspapers over that weekend of people in agony and dread and fear right down at the front of the pens, some of them looking as if they were on the verge of death, miraculously survived. One or two of the people who were at the front did actually die. But in the curious way that these things happen, people died in little pockets. And you could point to an individual and see that person, know that that person was amongst the deceased. But they're 6, 7, 10 people back from the front of the pen. And everybody around them survived, and they didn't. And it had a lot to do with how people were literally jammed together and whether they had any chance of getting a breath of air to keep them going, or whether they were just so wedged in against other people or against the crush barriers on the terraces that they weren't able to get a breath of air. So death that day was random, and it certainly didn't conform to this idea that the police had about how it was that people had died. Now, how on earth did it take 27 years to finally sort this case out? A good question to ask, bearing in mind that by the end of the summer of 1989, within months of this disaster, Lord Taylor, a High Court judge, had produced a report. And I'm just going to briefly read to you from the judgment. This is from the judgment of Lord Judge, the Lord Chief Justice, when the High Court overturned the original inquest verdicts in December of 2012 and ordered the new inquest to take place. And Lord Judge said this, amongst other things. Within a very short time, it was being peddled about that this disaster was one more consequence of the kind of hooliganism which had manifested itself at and around football matches during the 1980s. There was, therefore, fertile ground for the acceptance of rumour, gossip, and deliberate misinformation. In short, the disaster was attributed to the drunken misbehaviour of the fans, and the Liverpool fans in particular. Yet in August 1989, Lord Justice Taylor stated in quite unequivocal terms that the main reason for the disaster was the failure of police control. And he was referring there to the idea of opening this exit gate without making sure that the tunnel was closed off. And as Lord Judge went on to say, that should have been that. Unfortunately, he said, the culpability of the police was not acknowledged, and indeed a campaign was mounted to undermine confidence in Lord Justice Taylor's conclusions. These were developed at the inquests which took place in the winter of 1990 and 1991 and continued thereafter. Notwithstanding its falsity, the tendency to blame the fans was disappointingly tenacious, and it lingered on for many years. So you've got a clear indication there from the Lord Chief Justice in 2012, reminding us all that Lord Taylor's report had effectively decided all the issues. The police were to blame. He exonerated the fans of blame. How on earth, therefore, did what followed happen? Why was it that for a quarter of a century after that, these families who had suffered badly enough by losing a loved one, a relative of theirs in the disaster, then found themselves being blamed, in effect, for what had happened and vilified? Well, the answer is quite simple. Those first inquests. They were held by a weak and compliant coroner in this city who was, if I'm generous to him, at least bullied by the South Yorkshire police to ensure that the police got the result that they wanted. And all the evidence that they had put together for Lord Taylor's report, which evidently hadn't impressed Lord Taylor, was redeployed. Statements in which officers blamed the fans, claiming that large numbers of them were incredibly drunk, that many of them didn't have tickets, and that vast numbers of them turned up very late, completely overwhelming the police, so that they had no choice in the matter. Not true. The video evidence shows that the build-up of the crowd was getting significant as early as 2:15, a full 45 minutes before kick-off. By 2:30, serious measures needed to be taken, one, the most obvious of which, often used at that time, was delay the kick-off. No doubt about it, if you tell football fans that the kick-off is going to be delayed by 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it may be, people relax because they realise there's no longer the same imperative, the same urgency to get into the ground in time for kick-off. It should have been considered. It was actually ruled out on the day. And at the time of those first inquests, many of the families, unrepresented by any lawyers at all, had very little to go on. The law on inquests in those days, very different to that which it is today. And in the circumstances, no great surprise that the jury found that the deaths of the 96 were accidental. Accidental. Something that infuriated the families, because the one thing they knew for certain was their loved ones didn't die in an accident. This was completely foreseeable. The inquest heard evidence about previous incidences on these same terraces at previous big matches, including semi-finals, which highlighted to people the dangers that there were, even before the pens were put in. And you don't really need to think very long before you look at these pens, cages, in any other language, and realise that you've got to be very careful about how you police this if you are to avoid disaster. Now, I just want to say something on a very different topic here, really, which is about how we worked in these inquests. Because we started off with disclosure of about 500,000 pages of material. And I don't know if you can imagine what 500,000 pages looks like. I can't, and I've tried. But I did work out in one moment, when I obviously didn't have enough to do, that you could fill about 1,200 lever arch files with 500,000 pages. 1,200. I mean, the wall space that it would take to put those on shelving is horrendous. And then how would you find anything? You'd have to have the most amazing index to ever be able to find anything if you've got 1,200 lever arch files to go through to find a document. So, not surprisingly perhaps, the whole case was done electronically, which meant that we could bring up documents. Every page had a unique reference number, so that we could bring up pages which had witness statements, photographs, operational orders that the police and ambulance service had used, massive amounts of correspondence, all manner of things. Now, the team that I was in, we had 22 of the families in our group. There was a little bit of overlap between families, probably less than you might think, but over the course of time there have been some disputes between various family members, some families who historically had been perhaps distant from each other, and so there was a little bit of overlap, so that we had 22 families, and the overall group that Brenda and Anna were part of had, I think it was 77. So obviously 77 and 22 is 99, not 96, but there was a little bit of overlap. But we had 22 families. Now, we had a team of 5 barristers. There were 2 QCs, myself and Pete Weatherby. We had 3 junior barristers, and below that we had a large team which consisted of some solicitors, some paralegals, some people who had qualified for the bar but weren't in practice, and so on. And our teams were divided up according to different subjects. So we had a whole team dealing with stadium safety, for example, or events of the day, or the pathology, or the rescue attempt after the disaster became apparent, and so on. And so when all the documents came in, they would be, as we called it, triaged, and they would be sent to the individual teams dealing with that part of the case. They then had to work out what their relevance was. And it all worked in this way, that when we came to the witnesses, the barristers, Pete and I, were provided with a brief for each witness in the case. And probably the best part about the briefs was that we had the capability to link the documents in our storage system into the working documents. We used Google Drive. And so we had a hyperlink so that we had a list, for example. You bear in mind some people had maybe made 3 statements at the time. They'd given evidence to Lord Taylor. They gave evidence at the inquests. There was later a scrutiny in 2000. They had given later statements to the new police inquiry called Operation Resolve, and some of them were given statements as well to the Police Complaints Commission, which was also involved. So some people, we had 8 or more different statements that they had given. And by having hyperlinks to our storage system, we were able to click on the link and immediately go straight to that statement, which saved us a massive time, as you can imagine, when we were preparing for the case. So this would have been impossible to do if it had been paper-based. With the number of legal teams in the court in Warrington, a specially commissioned floor of an office block, as it happened, which was taken over and made into a court for 2 years, it would have been full of paper before anybody had managed to get in there if we hadn't been doing it electronically. And despite our skepticism, the Wi-Fi worked and everything ran more or less as smoothly as we might have asked. What was it like working with the families? It's hard to explain how important this case was for these people who had, as I say, lost loved ones and then spent 25 years defending their reputation, their own reputation, the reputation of the city of Liverpool, and bearing in mind not all of the deceased came from Liverpool. They were Liverpool fans, they didn't all live in Liverpool. And they reacted to the new inquests in different ways. We had some people, some of our families, who never came to a day of the inquest because I guess they just couldn't face it. We had other members who didn't miss a day of the inquests over more than 2 years. Working with them involved obviously a huge amount of what you know as client care, just basically looking after their basic requirements as clients, but also managing expectations. One of the verdicts that had been technically available even in 1989 was called unlawful killing. But unlawful killing equates to homicide, obviously, effectively manslaughter. And the test for an unlawful killing verdict in an inquest is the same as the criminal courts, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, whereas all of the other issues in an inquest are the normal civil standard, which is proof on the balance of probabilities. Now, obviously, we were asked repeatedly, what are the chances of Mr. Duckenfield, the senior match commander, being found responsible for the unlawful killing of our loved ones? And some people felt much more strongly about that than others. And we had to explain the difficulties there were with the law, the fact that it was so many years after the event, the fact that the only basis on which the jury could find unlawful killing was the actions or failures of Mr. Duckenfield alone. They obviously couldn't blame him for what they perceived to be the failures of other senior police officers on the day. And we had to explain to them the real difficulties that there were with getting such a verdict. We thought that there was a real chance that the jury might think that it was unfair to effectively put the blame for this on one man's toes when he wasn't the only person who failed that day, and perhaps cognizant also of the consequences there would be. So that was a key matter that we had to discuss repeatedly with our families, and I suspect that Brenda and Anna probably had very similar discussions with members of their family group as well. We ended up with a questionnaire for the jury of 14 questions, because these days juries are encouraged to bring in what's called a narrative verdict. In other words, they don't just say yes or no to a question, was it caused by this? They're asked to explain, if they want to, what the reasons for their answers are. And we were working on various drafts of this from the summer of 2015, and it finally went to the jury in January of this year. So it was in the making for something of the order of 6 months. And somehow in the course of the progression through different drafts, we ended up where the coroner wanted to leave an extremely controversial question to the jury, which invited them to consider whether the fans had had any part to play in the dangerous build-up of people outside the ground. Were the fans in any way to blame for that, as the police were contending, or not? On one sense, and the way that the coroner put this, what better thing for everybody involved if you get a jury who can exonerate the fans from any blame, which was true. But these were inquests. This wasn't a public inquiry. And at an inquest, generally speaking, the only issues are, how did the people who died die? But there were a lot of people in those pens that afternoon who went through almost the same identical experience as those who died, and only by some fluke of nature, the way they were standing, who they were up against, or what they were crushed against, many of them survived. But they went through exactly the same crush. They told us in graphic detail about what it's like to experience what some people did not survive. The survivors of the Hillsborough disaster had no representation in the inquest because, in effect, it wasn't about the survivors. But this question that the coroner decided to leave to the jury about whether the fans had had some part to play in the build-up to the disaster obviously meant that if the jury answered it in a particular way, it would mean they were blaming the fans, at least in part, and blaming people who'd been through the disaster and seen their best friends crushed to death just in front of them. A pretty appalling scenario for them to have to face. Well, as you know, when it came to the jury's conclusions, the jury answered the unlawful killing question that they did consider that the 96 were unlawfully killed, and they completely exonerated the fans from any blame in the disaster, which is why, bearing in mind there were 14 questions on the questionnaire, and bearing in mind that these were football people, they were immediately talking about Liverpool winning 14-0. Now, the last day was extraordinary because the outpouring of emotion from people who have been engaged in this process as long as they had, who probably had become pretty cynical with very good reason to thinking that they were never going to get a just result out of this, being asked to put their trust in lawyers who they hadn't met until shortly before the inquest. And the relief and the joy of finally getting what they believed were just verdicts was absolutely extraordinary. It's something that I have never experienced in nearly 40 years as a barrister, and I'm quite sure I won't do in the remaining years of my career. And I'm just going to finish with one thing. Now two things. We know that the Director of Public Prosecutions is currently considering whether there will be any prosecutions. She is considering whether David Duckenfield will be prosecuted for manslaughter because of the jury's verdict of unlawful killing. He is the only person at risk of being charged with manslaughter. We know that the police have been considering, and the CPS are now considering, whether others involved in other aspects of the case, whether it's health and safety issues, which can sound a little bit feeble by comparison with 96 deaths, but nonetheless may be relevant. And also whether there are people to be charged as a result of the cover-up of the evidence that took place. And we have to wait until sometime in 2017 when we're promised decisions about that. The final thing I want to finish on is this. After the inquests had finished, the family lawyers have jointly put in a submission to the Home Secretary, who of course at the time was Theresa May, with a draft bill, which for convenience sake at the moment we're calling Hillsborough Law. Because what turned Hillsborough from a disaster into an outrage was this institutional denial that kicked in. So that instead of accepting blame and saying we got this wrong horribly and we're very sorry and we've learnt the lessons, what the families found was the police dug in, the ambulance service dug in, the football club even dug in, and you had the unedifying experience of seeing the police blaming the fans, the ambulance service blaming the fans, the ambulance service blaming the club blaming various bodies, and nobody saying we ought to take responsibility for this. And so what we have proposed in the draft bill is that in future public authorities like the police, the ambulance service, local authorities, but also private entities such as football clubs which allow the public into their premises for the purposes of entertainment, should bear a duty of candour, so that rather than going into a defensive mode and saying, not our fault, nothing to do with us, don't blame us, they would be under a duty to accept blame if it's right, and be under a duty to cooperate with inquiries, and under a duty to make full disclosure of documents at an early stage so that proper culpability can be understood, rather than this defensiveness that we have seen. And I don't know the extent to which you know this. You will know that the now former Chief Constable of South Yorkshire, a man by the name of Mr. Crompton, was suspended the day after the inquest after a statement that he had made, in which, amongst other things, he apologised profusely on behalf of his police force for the disaster. What you may not know is that that's what Mr. Crompton did in the immediate aftermath of the report of the Hillsborough Independent Panel in 2012, which was the basis on which the original inquest verdicts were overturned. And he apologised in terms of the failure of the police on the day to act properly and prevent the deaths, and also, interestingly, apologised for the lies that were told about Liverpool fans thereafter. And so we were all amazed when we got to the inquest to find that his legal team, rather than standing up and saying, well, the Chief Constable has made this statement, we're not going to go behind that, that's the position of the South Yorkshire Police. During the inquest, they piggybacked on the aggressive questioning of, on behalf of the match commanders, Mr. Duckenfield, but also two of the other match commanders on the day. And I'm not saying they took the lead in trying to denigrate the fans, but they joined in complete denial of the apology made by Mr. Crompton. Now, it's that sort of thing because we asked the coroner to tell the jury that he had apologised. And I still think the jury should have known. It would have saved a lot of time. These inquests could have been done in half the time they took if it hadn't been for the attitude taken by the police and the ambulance service. And that's why we're saying this needs to stop, because it was quite bad enough that the families suffered the loss that they did in the disaster. But then to face 25, 26, 27 years in a struggle for justice, just because these organisations went into defensive mode and would not own up to their errors and their mistakes, compounded their suffering. And it's something that the families feel would be a fitting legacy for their loved ones to be remembered by, that in future authorities will be under a duty of candour, which ought to mean that if there was any such disaster in the future, there would be no opportunity for the public bodies involved to deny their responsibility in the way that happened in Hillsborough. Well, I've been about 40 minutes. That's quite enough from me, and I'm going to hand over now to Brenda.